I gave up college, took the late-night calls, and kept my father's business alive. Then they handed it to my brother. He broke my sister and ran. But there are lines you don't dare cross. This is the story of the golden child, the chosen one, who became the nail in the coffin of the Robert family. The chair by the window had a crescent of sun worn into its arm, a pale, stubborn patch where my father tapped his cigarette and read the same thin ledger for 20 years. When he grew sick, the chair didn't move. It simply waited with the same patience I had learned to carry like an extra coat. I learned then that patience can become a profession. People like to think of sacrifice as a single great thing. Missing a wedding, giving away an inheritance, stepping in during an emergency. For me, it was hundreds of tiny decisions that stacked up until they looked, from the outside, like a life built on purpose. From the inside, it felt more like a slow erasure. I had wanted to graduate. I'd wanted the tassel, the cheap pride of a degree that would let me say my name with more authority, but the hospital bill came the week of finals. My father coughed while he counted change, and the threads of the business frayed at the seam. So I stayed. I did the work people imagine when they think of family duty. I learned the ledger's spine until the numbers felt like fingers. I learned clients' birthdays and their wives' favorite wines, and whether Mr. Burton preferred a firm handshake or a long, solitary cigarette with his accounting advice. I learned to be the person who answered at 2 in the morning, who visited suppliers when the rain swelled the river and a delivery had to be renegotiated in mud. I learned to fix the awning after the last storm, to put my shoulder where it was needed without ever announcing that I had done it. It is an odd thing, being invisible in plain daylight. People assumed the business belonged to my parents. Sometimes they asked Dad for the decision when he had neither the strength nor the breath to be an arbiter. I was the man who rose earlier than anyone and slept later than everyone else. The man who kept the lights on and the engines oiled. I was, in small ways, indispensable. Anthony came home from college like a breeze, all easy hair and borrowed charm. He wanted to talk about music and parties, about the future like it had nothing to do with ledgers and tired hands. My parents were smitten with him in the way gardeners are with a sudden bloom. The delight was sudden and extravagant. They played his records in the kitchen like a hymn and laughed at his jokes until their faces relaxed. When my father's cough worsened, they clasped Anthony's hands like they were holding a talisman. That is when the cracks first showed themselves as light. I remember holding a stack of unpaid invoices and hearing my mother ask, without turning, if Anthony would take a turn doing some light bookkeeping, because it would be good experience for him. She looked at me with a softness that would have meant gratitude if it belonged to me. Instead, I felt something cold and familiar. The recognition that what I had been doing for years could be recategorized as a favor in a single sentence. Small slights accumulate faster than you think. A photograph taken in the shop window, the one where the family smiles awkwardly, placed Anthony at the center and left me half hidden at the edge like a stain the photographer chose to ignore. At a celebration for a client who had been with us for decades, my mother toasted Anthony's future leadership and gave me a hand on the shoulder she had never given for the nights I sat by the till waiting for collections to clear. The hand was kind, but it felt performative, as if it were a prop to make their sun shine. I told myself I was above such petty counting of favors. I told myself the business needed steadiness, not displays. But there was a night I remember with a clarity that stings. The rain was hard enough to run the gutters like rivers, and the shop light hummed on alone. I had stayed late to reconcile a set of accounts, and the ledger's margins spilled with corrections I could make by memory. My father called from his hospital room. He always called at odd hours to ask the same small things about who had paid what. I listened to his breath and felt the ledger under my fingers like a map I had traced for years. That night, when I closed the shop, I sat in the car for a long time with the engine off. I held the steering wheel and let the rain erase the world for a while. I wanted to think that when the time came, the family would look at me and see what I had done, but the house had a different plan. They chose Anthony. I still remember the way my father's face folded when he announced it in the kitchen while the kettle clicked softly on the stove. "It's time we handed the reins over," he said, and his voice had the weary certainty of someone who wanted a decision more than he wanted the right one. My mother's lips trembled in the kind of pride that makes people clumsy. Anthony. Anthony, who had been away from the daily grind, whose decisions were measured in moments and Instagrammed weekends, smiled like a boy who had just been given back a toy. They spoke of fresh ideas and a new generation. They spoke in platitudes as if history were a sentence to be edited. There were meetings at the bank and signatures to be pressed and a ceremony of transfer dressed in coffee and polite speeches. No one explained why the person who had kept the clients warm through winters and summers, who had turned up when the lights threatened to go out, should be set aside for the son who had never once been the person to hold a ledger at midnight. The reasons, I was told later in softer tones, were about optics, Anthony's degree, his charisma, his connections. It was as if the painstaking scaffolding of years could be made invisible by a degree and a smile. I left the family business that week with the sort of civility that fools people into thinking wounds have healed. I sent in my formal notice and handed over my keys and tried to sleep. The shop smelled the same as it had always smelled. Paper, coffee, the faint tang of cigar smoke where my father's hand had rested before the sickness took him. I was leaving behind a world I had supported with all my small, unpaid acts, and the only weight I carried was a polite refusal that sounded like a promise. I would not make it a scene. I did what people who have been denied usually do. I took what I had, enough to start again, but nothing to make trouble. It is important that anyone who reads this knows the line between theft and survival. I never pocketed money meant for wages. I never broke trust in a way that could be called theft. What I had was years of goodwill. Clients who trusted me because I had called them in storms, suppliers who owed me favors because I had let them wait around my office for a week while their own troubles smoothed. A few private contracts taped together by favors and a modest savings account I had carved out from overtime. That was my capital. I rented a small office above a florist's shop where the air was heavy with lilies and the landlord was kind and a little forgetful about rent. I bought a sign secondhand, sanded its edges until my palms bled a little and the wood smelled of dust and work. I put up a nameplate with my own name and the years I'd spent in the business. It was not much. It felt a little like dressing in your father's old coat, so it would fit. The first client who walked through my door was a woman named Mrs. Kale. She had been with my family's firm for almost 19 years. Her husband had died the winter my father first fell ill, and she had always spoken to me more than to anyone else because I would listen. She walked up the narrow stairs with a cane and a gentle look that said she had been through worse and would not be scared of shifting loyalties. She signed a contract and told me, plainly, that I had been a fixture in her life. "You were there," she said. "Not always with a word, but you were there when it mattered." It was the first time anyone used that phrase about me without a twinge of explanation. Her business was small, but when she left, she told several acquaintances. Word travels oddly fast when people like you. Business, however, was not an instant bloom. It was a slow, stubborn seed at first. A neighbor who brought a referral, the assistant who printed invoices for me because she believed in the steady way I answered the phone. I learned to make do without the grand spread of staff I had once had under my father's name. I learned to be surgical with expenses. I ate cheaper food and worked later and made friends with clients over the old language of trust. I became, in a quieter way, the man I had always been, the one who showed up. Anthony, in the meantime, flailed. It was in the newspapers and in the whispers in the market. The family firm, which had run on the bones of my father's steadiness and the muscle of steady hands, choked under inexperienced management. Contracts were missed, wages delayed, suppliers grew impatient. Anthony's charm did not translate into ledgers. Charisma does not balance checks. I saw his name in passing, in a headline about unpaid wages and a labor dispute. I did not celebrate his faltering. Private satisfaction, when it came, tasted like dust. He could not bear it. One morning, a letter stained and blunt arrived at my office, a court summons. He accused me of poaching clients. He said I had schemed and siphoned funds, that I had plotted for years to steal the business I'd been refused. He painted a picture of premeditation, of a man who had quietly undermined his own family for the promise of a better seat at the table. He asked the law to bind me up and make me answer for the crime of ambition. The irony of that accusation, that the man who had given his life to keep the family business alive should be accused of undermining it, was not lost on anyone. The complaint carried with it a poison more effective than any legal remedy: rumor. Even friends who would have defended me began to distance themselves. Business does not enjoy being dragged into court. Customers fled like birds at the sound of thunder, not because they believed my guilt, but because trouble is a contagion they do not want to catch. The hearing itself was a theater I had never wished to enter. My mother sat in the audience with her face a mask of something between disbelief and defense. Anthony spoke with the precision of a man who had been coached, his sentences cut and pressed into a version of hurt that suited the court's appetite. My mother testified, and so did Denise, our youngest, whose voice shouted through the room in the way only a frightened young person can. They said I had always wanted to take the clients, that I had been funneling funds, that my success had been built on dishonest foundations. I watched them say it as the ledger of my life unspooled across the room, and something in me contracted with a familiar ache that was not quite surprise and not quite betrayal. The judge, matter of fact, dismissed the case for lack of grounds. Technically, I had been vindicated. Practically, I had been smothered. The dismissal did little to patch the holes. My phone did not ring the way it had. Clients who had once trusted me now said they could not be involved in family disputes. People were careful, as if my presence carried the possibility of trouble. It is easy to describe that period as tough, and even easier to say how I survived. But the truth, and I do not say this to pull pity, was quieter and worse. I felt erased. The town began to imagine me as a man who had tried to take what belonged to his family, and accusations are like seeds. They grow in all directions, rooting in places that nothing but time can unlearn. So I started again, with thrift and small, slow tricks. I knocked on doors I had not dared to knock on years earlier, when wearing the weight of the family name had been a shield. I wrote letters by hand. I made sure every invoice was a little more pleasant than anyone would expect. I returned calls at ridiculous hours. I learned the difference between being known and being necessary. The two are not the same. Rebuilding had become a muscle. After the suit, after the nights in the car and the kindnesses from people like Mrs. Alvarez and Mara, I learned to carry small successes without fanfare. My days were full of invoices and calls, the honest rhythm of work that has no interest in spectacle. Some clients returned because honesty. I slept more. I learned the sound of my own breath again. For a while it felt safer to be unnoticed. Then, one gray morning, I read the headline that made my hands go cold. Anthony on the run, family business collapsing. The article was short, economical, and cruel. The firm had missed payroll again, suppliers had filed liens, and there had been a domestic incident at the family home that left a young woman critically injured. My first reaction was not triumph. It was a slow, sinking dread that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with blood. I called my mother. Her number had been one of those things I avoided, part strategy, part survival. She answered on the third ring, and the sound that came through the line was not the cultivated calm she used in public. She was crying in a way that undid me. Not those small, solvent tears of embarrassment, but a raw, rattling sound that meant something had been broken beyond words. "Will," she said, and the name was a small boat in a storm. "We're at St. Mary's. Denise." The rest spilled out in a single, jagged sentence. Denise had been pushed, she'd fallen, her spine snapped. The doctors said she might never walk again. Anthony had been seen leaving the house in a state that made no pretense of sobriety, and then he disappeared. My legs went lame. I do not remember putting on shoes. I do remember the car engine starting like an animal going too fast. The drive to the hospital was spare of thought. My mind made the city into a tunnel and focused on the destination. In the emergency waiting area, the air smelled of antiseptic and fear. My mother was a small, folded figure in a chair, her face drained of the gloss she used to keep strangers at bay. The sight of her crying in public, that image is the kind of thing that pushes open chest cavities. She looked older than the last photograph I had of her. Grief had hollowed her in a way that left no margin for denial. She pushed him for. My mother told me when I could finally find the words for an entrance. We asked him where the money went. Denise, she spoke straight. She has his temper, but she has a voice. She wanted answers. He snapped. He punched her. She hit the table, and the doctor says she could not finish without crying again. The rest I filled in like a man mapping the obvious. The distance between a shove and a life changed is alarmingly short. Where is he? I asked, the question out of habit and not of hope. He left, my mother said. He's missing. The police say he's on the run. There are a dozen small ways rage can manifest. Mine went first to a single, animal heat. The thought that the thing I had given my life to, the people I had cared for, had been ruined by a man who had always wanted to outshine me and never had the patience to learn. I felt a violence rise that was not theatrical. It was not the sort of thing that would make me proud later. It was the kind of hot, simple vow people make when the world seems to have stolen something irretrievable. For all you've done to me, I said aloud, though it sounded like I was addressing the empty chair. I won't let this slide. Nearly killing our sister? Hell no. My mother looked at me then in a way that stripped off all the pet names and the politeness. Find him, she said. Please find him. I spent the next hours and then days with the police. My knowledge of the firm, the ledgers, the people who had worked there became a resource I surrendered without shame. If I had been able to sit in the old office and name every vendor and every client, now that intimacy paid off. I worked with detectives the way I used to balance accounts, meticulously. I went through bank notices, supplier filings, petty cash affidavits. I traced transfers Anthony had made, the small withdrawals he'd hidden as miscellaneous expenses, the sudden checks to offshore accounts that looked like gambling payouts. Where Anthony had been reckless, he had also been sloppy in ways that could be followed. There were pieces to the puzzle only the firm could provide. Grace helped me compile documents the police needed. Mara tracked down men who had been paid in cash and were now afraid to tell the truth. I sat across from an investigator in a booth and spoke in the same calm cadence I used with clients, but beneath it was a fury that made the words sharp. I gave the police a map of places Anthony might go, people he would fool for money or for sympathy, the motels he'd visited with a single suitcase, the card rooms where he liked to disappear into cigarette smoke and loud machines. The manhunt that followed had the slow, procedural rhythm of a hunt that is not a spectacle. Detectives worked leads that I fed like pieces of meat to a hound. There was surveillance, quiet stakeouts at cheap hotels, calls at odd hours to numbers that petered out. It felt like staking out the memory of a life I had helped build, not to gloat over his fall, but to prevent him from running from the consequences of what he had done. At night, I would fall into a chair and go through the same motions I'd used to rebuild a company. Itemize, prioritize, act. The capture was not cinematic. It happened in a motel off the interstate when a desk clerk, suspicious of a man who used cash too easily and who ordered room service at 3 a.m., tipped off an officer. The police moved quickly. Anthony's face, when the knock came, had that look of a man who had finally met a fact he had been evading. He tried to charm his way out at first, a reflex, then stumbled into argument, and then silence. I was there when they brought him through the station, but I did not approach. There was a moment when his eyes found mine. He looked older than his years and smaller. For a second, I felt something like pity cut through the heat in my chest, and then the memory of Denise's eyes shut it off. The criminal charges came fast: assault, fraud, willful mismanagement of company funds. The state moved to make examples when the public was watching a family unravel. I also filed a civil suit for the wrongs done, for Denise, for the workers owed pay, for the creditors who'd been misled. The courtroom felt familiar in an odd way. I had stood in such rooms before, but never on this side of the table with so much at stake. Anthony's defense was a theater of grief. He pleaded diminished responsibility. He brought witnesses who spoke of his diagnosis, bipolar affective disorder, and his treatments. He argued that his condition had made him impulsive, that he had sought to prove himself in ways that were self-destructive, that he craved his mother's approval and had been driven to an edge his medication only sometimes kept at bay. The words had a pleading quality. They were also, in part, an attempt at narrative control. He said aloud what he had always told himself in private, that he never truly wanted the business, that he only ever wanted to make our mother proud. The trial laid everything bare. There were hospital records, bank transfers, testimony from employees who had been cheated out of wages, and then Denise's own voice when she testified with the steadiness of someone who had been made to carry a weight she did not choose. The prosecution presented a pattern of transfers and gambles that suggested deliberation rather than a momentary lapse. They documented trips to card rooms and online accounts traced to the firm. My suit for civil damages and the state's criminal prosecution ran parallel like two tracks of a train headed for the same station. Anthony's diagnosis complicated things, and not just legally. Mental illness is a real thing. I do not pretend it is otherwise. But the record showed years of manipulation of funds, repeated overdrafts, and decisions that made no sense for a person managing a small, local firm. The jury got both pictures, a man ill, and a man who had used illness as both explanation and, they believed, a veil for calculated choices. The courtroom watched him, sometimes with pity, sometimes with contempt. I watched him sit through it all, his hands folded like a child's. When the verdict came, the judge's sentence felt like a glass closing. 30 years. It was more than the practical time a man of Anthony's age might serve. It was a portrait painted in stern lines about the gravity of destroying other people's lives for the sake of vanity and the cruelty of striking a woman who had asked for facts. I felt my throat go dry. The sentence did not fix Denise. It did not undo the grin my mother once preferred to me in photographs. It did, however, make accountability real in a way nothing else had. After the sentencing, the family collapsed inward. The firm declared bankruptcy. There was no saving a house whose roof had been built of bad loans and immediacy. The people who had once praised our name moved away or turned their faces to other businesses. My mother, who had once stood in public with the type of pride that made her beloved at gatherings, came to me in a way I had not expected, small, contrite, stripped of the performance she had once wielded like armor. She asked for mercy. She asked for forgiveness. She said things I had waited to hear all my life. Apologies, explanations, a pouring out of regret, so complete it looked almost habitual in its intensity. There were tears, hands clasped, and that old plea I had once given to other people when I needed help. I sat with her in the hospital corridor with Denise asleep behind glass and watched the woman who had raised me beg in a way that felt both earnest and belated. "You never loved me," I said at last, the words raw and clean and final in a way I had not intended. "You never saw me as your son. You saw me as a slave, someone to do the work and be put aside. Do you know what you and father put me through after I toiled for you too?" My voice did not rise. It carried the steadiness of the ledger finally balanced. "I don't hold anything against you, not in the way you seem to want me to. But know this, to me, you're dead." The sentence landed like a legal finding. She flinched. As for Denise, I continued, softer only in tone, not in intent, "I will ensure she is cared for. I will send the money directly to the hospital's trust account. That way you cannot divert it." I paused. The thought of allowing my mother the possibility of misdirecting the funds made my skin crawl. "I've forgiven you, if that is what you need me to say to breathe easier. But you won't get a dime from me. Not now. Not ever." It was both cruelty and clarity. I was not proud of the hardness of that moment. I was not sure it was mercy or cruelty that motivated me so much as an absolute refusal to be betrayed again. The ledger of my life, which had once been allowances and quiet sacrifices, finally had a margin that would not be written on. When the hospital lights dimmed and the corridor emptied, I sat alone for a long time. The chair by the window was a memory with sun worn into its arm. The ledger was a book of accounts, both financial and moral. I had counted everything, and the sum was ugly and true. The family had failed Denise and had tried to make me invisible as they rearranged their lives. Justice, such as it was, had been served by the courts. But justice is a blunt instrument. It cannot rebuild a spinal cord or restore the laughter that once warmed a kitchen. I had won in a way that left me hollow. The town would now watch my business grow as the other fell. Some would call that the neat arc of karma. I would know better. There would be no speeches, no celebration. My revenge had been practical. I helped stop a man who hurt people. I sued to make the books right, and I secured Denise's care. The rest, the deadness I felt toward my mother, the empty place at our table, would be for me to live with. That night, I walked past the old shop. The sign still swung in the breeze, but the paint had peeled and the windows were dark. I touched the memory of the chair as if it were some relic left behind and felt, if anything, a kind of exhausted peace. The ledger in my head had been reconciled. The cost of that balance was heavy, and the price would be paid in the years ahead in visits and checks and quiet support to Denise, who, in the terrible way the world has of making strength from weakness, had taught me more about endurance than any courtroom ever would. What are your thoughts? Should I have forgiven my mother, or was I too hard on her after all that happened? Drop your comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.